I'm Joanna.
And hi, I'm Marco. We are from the Sheffield Biomedical Robotics Lab. Our lab focuses on soft medical robots and especially surgical robots. So robots that go inside the human body and can interact with human tissue to treat medical conditions.
So you might have seen some soft robots on TV. There's like Baymax, the big sort of white friendly robot on Big Hero 6. And so soft robots are characterized by being made of soft material. So right here I've got an elastomer, so it's really stretchy. And because it's stretchy, it has many degrees of freedom, so you can bend it in all sorts of directions. But then if you constrain it, you can make it grow as well as bend and twist.
Right. So the idea behind soft robot is that the softer the better. So as Joanna was suggesting, think about the Euro 6. So if imagine like running into a soft cushion, that's definitely better than running into a brick wall, right? Because that would really hurt. So soft robots are better when there's interactions with humans. So that's why people are trying to really develop these robots. And especially in our case, where the robots go inside the human body, we really want them to be soft because we don't want to cause any damage to the surrounding tissue and organs.
So our lab in particular, we focus on regenerative robots. These are robots that are designed to grow soft tissue, in particular in the gastrointestinal tract. So that's how you digest your food. And so to grow the tissue, what we do is we stimulate it. So there's this term called mechanotherapy. And the idea is that you apply forces on the tissue. So you stretch it and then you relax it, and then you stretch it some more and relax it. And by this repeated cycle of stretching and relaxing, you sort of encourage the cells to proliferate and to grow the tissue. So right now, I'll show you one of our robots. So we'll do a quick demo. So I'll bring you to this camera, hopefully. So right here, this is one of our robots that we have in the lab. So this one is made of 3 different stacks, and they've got bubbles. So we've also got these syringe drivers here that are colored with different liquids. And so I've got this little joystick here. And if I press down on the joystick, what we see is that the liquid starts being pumped into our actuator, and then the bubbles are going to start growing. So we can already start seeing them. We've got a nice big red bubble starting growing, and the green and blue are sort of following. And then if we inflate it more and more and more, we can sort of start seeing the upper level inflating as well. And then what we can do is, for example, if I start deflating, for example, the red one, we can have bending behaviors. So our robot will start bending, and we can sort of bend it in all sorts of directions. And here we sort of connected them fluidically in columns, but imagine if you start connecting them with the neighboring bubble on the upper level, you can sort of start getting twisting behaviors as well.
So now let's imagine this robot, like we can shrink it down and place it into the human body. In our lab, we have 2 examples we'd like to keep in mind to develop our robots. In particular, these are long gap esophageal atresia and short bowel syndrome. So in the first case, you can see here on our whiteboard, you have a baby with one bit of the esophagus missing. And this is a really problematic condition because the baby cannot really swallow food, right? And the second one is short bowel syndrome. So here you see there's a lot of black in here, while it should be all pink. So it means the bowel is really short, and this prevents the baby to be able to absorb all the nutrients from food. So these 2 conditions, we need to find a way to solve it, and we'd like to use our robotic implants for that.
So if you imagine our little stacked actuator from before, so we've got a little stack here. So three layers, right? And so if you imagine that we put that inside the esophagus of our baby, right? And then we sort of blow and stimulate our tissue, sort of increasing and decreasing sort of the level of the bubbles. And then we get a nicely fully inflated soft actuator. And then our tissue would have grown with it. And similarly for our little baby here, in his intestine, we'd have our small little actuator that would start off, and then we sort of blow it, inflate the balloons, and then we'd have our fully grown actuator in a longer tissue. And so obviously these experiments take a lot of time, and we need a lot of extensive testing. And that's something that Marco is going to show us next.
Yeah, so you need to imagine tissue is alive, so it can actually grow, but it takes weeks to do that. So imagine you are pulling on the tissue, as Joanna was saying, and then releasing it. After a long while, cells starts proliferating, and you get some growth there. And after weeks, you can definitely like close this gap so that then the doctor can suture the 2 bits together and let's say problem solved, right? Now, obviously, before you reach that stage where you can actually implant the robotic implant in there, it takes a lot of experiments and preclinical trials, we call them. So it means we need to first prove that our robot is reliable and capable of doing what it needs to be doing. And what we're especially interested in is the interaction between the robot and the human tissue. So what we really need is to replicate the behavior of tissue, right? So you can imagine tissue is like a spring. So imagine you have a spring with you. You start pulling on the spring elongates at first, but then it gets harder and harder to elongate it more. That behavior is called stiffness, and tissue is like a spring. You can think about tissue as a complex set of springs. And we developed a robotic platform, which is called the soft tissue simulator, that is capable of replicating this springiness of soft tissue. So Joanna will help me illustrate the platform now. We have a bottom plate that's fixed in place, and then we have a top plate that can move up and down based on the interaction with our robotic implant. So the robotic implant is placed there in the middle. You can see it exactly. And there's a force sensor right over the robot that senses the interaction between the robotic implant and the platform itself. So the higher the force, the higher the top plate will move, simulating the behavior of a spring. Now, we'd like to show you a quick the workings. Now, if we start inflating the soft actuator as Joanna was doing, in my case, I'm just using air. You see the bubble starts forming and the balloon moves, the top plate moves up, simulating the behavior of the spring. Right, so with this, and then if we deflate the bubbles, the force decreases and the platform moves down. And this is like the spring is relaxing, right? So with this platform, we are not only capable of simulating the springiness of tissue, but we're also capable of replicating the properties of soft tissue changing over time. So for example, imagine there's fibrosis. That means the tissue will become stiffer. We can do that with our platform. But the most interesting bit is probably about fault tolerance. So we like our robot to be safe and also be able to take care of their problems themselves, in the sense that you need to imagine once the robot is implanted inside the human body, then you cannot access it. So if there is a problem, the robot needs to be able to solve it itself without any external intervention, because otherwise that means doing a second surgical intervention to take the robot out of the human body, fix it, and then or replace it, right? And that's obviously not something we want to do.
So you've hopefully now seen a couple of the one of the actuators that we use in the lab, as well as our simulator. If you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them. So maybe you'd like to know how we make one. So, so what we do first to create our soft actuator is we've got this 3D printed base that's got gaps in which we can add our air or liquid, as well as some little inlets and outlets, so we can connect them all fluidically. We then have our silicon rubber membrane layer. So this is the layer that inflates, and that's the growing, and that's what gives us this balloon. And then on top of that, we then have our 3D printed constraint. And so there we've got some gaps in which the balloon can grow. So I mentioned a bit earlier, if you've got something that's really soft, obviously very elastic and can grow in any other direction. But by adding these constraints, we can target which direction we want it to grow in. And so that's kind of how we build our soft actuators, and then we attach all these layers together.
Yep. One problem. Oh, our favorite soft robot. I don't know about you, but there's one group in the US who developed an octopus-shaped robot, completely soft, and that was capable of moving using just increase in pressure in the various arms, let's say. That was really neat.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of my favorites. Yeah, there's quite a lot of work on octopus tentacles, obviously, because they're quite sort of, I don't know, one of the most ubiquitous examples of soft organisms. So they're quite cool as well, and there's quite a lot of work going into sort of replicating those soft tentacles themselves.
I'd say one of the problems with soft robots is actually the control. As you saw, Joanna just demonstrated. The nice thing about soft robots is that with a kind of simple setup, you can actually have many degrees of freedom and you can bend and twist. But you may have seen in my demo or Joanna's demo, the inflation is not that easy to control. So sometimes the balloons just inflate in a split second, and you don't know which one inflates first. That's because of it's really tricky to manufacture them really nicely. But yeah, that's one of the biggest challenges for now.
So we've got a question now from Eduardo. He's asked, how much force do you think it can exert? So for our clinical environment or whatever, we want to be able to sort of stretch the tissue with about 2.5 newtons. And so we have tested some of our actuators, and they are able to do that, and sometimes even more, sort of 7, 8, 9 newtons they're capable of.
Yeah. That's not to say that soft robots cannot do, cannot handle higher forces. So there are some groups that are not working in our fields, but more like macroscopic robots, let's say, that develop some robots that can actually lift tens of kilograms, let's say.
So we've got another question. So what's the standard medical techniques currently available for treating esophageal atresia, and how can soft robots improve treatment?
Right. You want to?
Yeah, so I guess one of the current treatments that doesn't involve robotics at all is for a surgeon to sort of insert sutures into the back of the baby, into the esophagus, and sort of tie it at the end of the esophagus, and then to slowly sort of pull on those sutures every sort of couple of days to sort of grow the tissue. And obviously this has got lots of risks. You can have like tearing of the sutures, and then you have to go back in and sort of tie them again. And it's also just very time consuming, and the baby itself has to be fully sedated. Yeah, so that's kind of one of the main risks. And so obviously soft robots, maybe you want to answer this one?
So the idea is then if we use our robotic implant, first, it's less risky to perform the procedure in general, because then the robot sits there and starts elongating over longer periods of time. The second thing is there's a feedback for the surgeon. So for now, we just showed you the actuation part, right? But then there's also the sensing part we're working on for our robot. So imagine you can definitely sense the length of your robot and the force that the interaction with the tissue. At that point, we can actually, let's say, create a procedure which is optimal for the patient. So we can maybe speed up the procedure because we find there's a treatment which works better for elongating and growing the tissue. So that means speeding up the procedure, making it safer. And we think potentially that's better for the baby because in the future, maybe the baby doesn't need to be sedated at all, like it can be awake. One thing you may be able to appreciate is the fact that our robot has a hole like that goes through the various layers. So that means food can go through there. And so potentially there's no need to like tube feed the baby, for example, during these weeks, during this week-long procedure.
Yeah, overall, we just help that it can be less invasive and sort of more optimal. So we've got another great question. How are cells behaving in the presence of these soft robots? So
there's actually PhD students in our lab, one of our colleagues, which is working on this. So you need to imagine this is a very, very new field, and no one really knows, actually. That's what we're trying to understand. Because, again, our goal is not only to grow soft tissue, but to grow healthy tissue and grow it fast, right? So Joanna was describing like pulling and releasing the tissue like periodically. But how and how much do you pull that tissue for how long or how at what frequency? So these are all parameters one needs to tune and optimize to get the best results possible. And this is what we are trying to work on using our robotic bioreactor. So this is a platform where we implant real cells, so live cells, not just our robotic tissue simulator, let's say. And we start like pulling on these cells at various rates and with various forces, and see like what works best, let's say.
And there have been some studies as well to sort of show that softer materials sort of don't damage the cells as much. So Marco kind of touched on that earlier, sort of softer is better kind of to interact with the tissue. Right, so we've got a great question of what are the biggest limitations, or what are the biggest limitations of soft robots? So, I mean, I'd probably say one of the biggest limitations is the fact that they are soft, and so they're just sort of prone to lots of faults because you can't necessarily have a lot of repeatability in them. There's sort of a lot of things that sort of determine the behavior, so it's not very deterministic. So, for example, you get like it might inflate all right one day, and then the next day it could inflate more. Like the materials tend to change quite a bit over time. And so having that repeatability and sort of the controllability that Marco was mentioning earlier is kind of one of the biggest difficulties.
I think one other problem is also the fact that it's very easy, let's say, to hurt a soft robot in the sense that you can just pierce the thin membrane that's inflating, and that would cause part of the soft robot to like fail, let's say, and that can happen quite easily, even without actually piercing the soft robot. But just imagine you overinflate your bubble, and that suddenly like bursts. I'm sure all of you experienced that using just party balloons, let's say. And again, I'd say there are some, let's say, limitations, but that's also what makes it interesting, right? Because then it means there's a lot of research there to be done to really explore all of the potential that's there. Because we think the, let's say, the benefits can really overcome all these limitations in time.
Yeah, I think we might have another question. Oh, what does the future hold for some robots?
Even more difficult.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot more work in sort of trying to integrate the different elements. So there's been a lot of work sort of working on sort of soft actuators, and that's pretty established. There's quite a lot of work out there. There's been some more recent work on sort of the sensing elements as well as the control elements, and sort of now people are trying to sort of tie it all together. And Marco mentioned a bit earlier, there's like one example of a soft octopus. It's called octopus, but it's called Octobot. It sort of integrates all of those elements, and it's got its sort of onboard computing as well as sort of onboard sensing and sort of actuating and sort of all bringing it all together.
Yeah, I'd say also some groups are working actually on what I was describing before. So imagine there's a problem like you pierce the soft robot, you want some sort of healing behavior there. So material scientists are actually working on self-healing silicons and rubber. So I'd say the easiest thing to consider is just a tire, like one of the tires on your car. Imagine there's a puncture, and after a while, the rubber just like melts together again, let's say. So you solve the problem without even noticing that. But I think the future looks bright, let's say. In our case, for example, the using these robots in the surgical field would mean like proving that the robots are actually safe and reliable. And these are probably the two main limitations of soft robots. Like, well, the reliability, I think, is the greatest one. So if we succeed in our goal, that's definitely something.
Oh, so we got another great question. How can young pupils, and students engage with soft robotics work? Well, so there's actually a great website called Soft Robotics. I think that's what it's called, and it gives you lots of examples of sort of soft robots you can make at home, and they've got sort of lots of the parts that you can buy, and sort of gives you sort of step-by-step tutorials of how you can get engaged. I think also you can just sort of, there are lots of fun YouTube videos out there from different research groups that you can kind of have a look and sort of see what they're up to.
And then obviously, if you are about to start university, come and pay us a visit here at our lab. I think that's definitely something you can look into. There's also our website you can visit to see what we are doing.
Right, it's called
And
Soft Robotics Toolkit. That's
all
what
right.
it's called. That one.
And I think this is definitely a nice field to like approach as a young student, also because the materials required are quite cheap, I'd say. And we didn't show you, but just to prove like what I'm saying, here we have one of our layers, one of our of the stacks, and we're just using a simple syringe to like blow up the balloon. Well, chose the wrong one. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'll just do that. Yeah. So you see, you can actually replicate the same behavior we were having, but like manually. So you don't need fancy setups to be able to perform some experiments on these soft robots.
Yeah, I think there are lots of sort of outreach materials that are coming as well, sort of using sort of even simple materials like your party balloons and stuff, by like configuring them in smart ways and sort of using syringes and stuff. You can sort of try out your own sort of little soft robots at home.
Right. So I'll start. So we sort of touched on this in when we were talking before. So there's a lot of things currently that involve surgery, so, that we hope to be able to replace by using a micro robot.
Oh, great question. What should people study in order to pursue further education in soft robots or medical robots?
I think the beauty of soft robots and robotics in general, but let's say especially soft robots, is the fact that there's so many disciplines that really are like giving something to soft robotics, let's say. So, for example, I studied mechanical engineering, but Joanna studied
So
control.
control engineering. And we've
So-
got other people in the lab who study like bioengineering or more electrical engineering, as well as sort of we don't necessarily have anyone, but like mechanical or material science would be a good one as well, because I mean
I'd say
obviously you've got a lot of material properties that you need to deal with, as well as potentially even just like chemistry or physics, maths. And
Yeah, definitely. I'd say there's not a set, let's say, path as long as you're doing scientific like subjects. So yeah, don't do literature, but anything else can really be helpful.
But I think there's also potential research going on sort of with like psychology elements and sort of using soft robots and sort of robots in general with sort of those sorts of fields. So there's quite a few different fields to have a look at. But yeah. Don't be worried. If you want to get involved with soft robots, you can choose whatever you want.
Structures are also used in solar panels. So when they fire them off, they can capture the
So
maximum.
I think we might sort of wrap up things. If you've got any last questions, feel free to type them in the chat. Otherwise, we'll be back sort of in the next 10 minutes. You can see it all again in case you missed anything, and type in some more questions as well.
So I think we're at this.
See you.
Bye.
We'll be going live again at
Hi, I'm Joanna.
And I'm Marco, and we are from the Sheffield Biomedical Robotics Lab. So our lab specializes in soft medical robots and especially surgical robots. So robots that go inside the human body and interact with soft tissue to treat medical conditions.
So you might have seen some soft robots on TV. So maybe you're familiar with Baymax, sort of the big white, fluffy sort of robot that you can see in Big Hero 6. And so soft robots are characterized by being made of soft material. So right here I've got an elastomer. So you can see it's very, very stretchy. And it can sort of bend in all sorts of degrees, into all sorts of directions. So it's got many degrees of freedom. And so obviously that's undesirable. So we don't want a robot that just goes in every direction. We want to sort of have it grow in sort of particular direction or targeted direction. So what we can do is we can constrain it. And when we constrain it, what we get is that we get robots that grow as well as twist and sort of bend.
Yeah. So the idea behind soft robots is that the softer the better, and this is because we'd like our robots to be as safe as possible. So you can imagine running into a cushion, that's probably fine, but if you run into a brick wall, that's a problem, right? So in our case, for example, the robots go inside the human body, so you really want them to be soft because you don't want to cause any harm or damage to the surrounding tissue and organs. And this is what soft robots can give you. That's probably their biggest advantage on against, say, hard robots, like classic rigid robots.
And so our lab in particular, we focus on regenerative robots. So these are robots that are designed to sort of grow tissue, in particular in the gastrointestinal tract. So that's where it's sort of the digestive system through which your food passes. And the way we grow tissue is the idea is that we stimulate it. And we do this sort of by a term that's called mechanotherapy. So the idea is that you sort of apply forces to the tissue, so you stretch it a bit, and then you relax it, and you stretch it some more and relax it. And this repeated sort of stretching, relaxing, sort of forces the cells or encourages the cells to proliferate, to sort of grow the tissue overall. So for that, we'll sort of show you one of our little actuators to start with. So I've got a quick demo here. So right here, we've got one of our actuators. So this is a modular sort of soft hybrid robot. And we've also got these syringe drivers with different colored liquids. So we've got some blue liquids, some green liquids, some red liquids. And then what we've done is with these stacks, we've sort of connected them fluidically. So we've got sort of columns of bubbles that are connected together. And so I've got this little joystick here, and I press down on it. Hopefully this would work. We'll get our soft robots to sort of inflate a bit. So we've got liquid being pumped into our system. And this will sort of make our bubbles grow. And so we've got our soft actuation that's going to grow and grow and grow. And so you start seeing it sort of balloon in, right? And so we've got a nice sort of long soft actuator. And then what I can do is I can sort of remove some of the liquid. So for example, if I start deflating sort of the red syringe, we'll get some sort of bending behavior as our sort of actuator sort of gets some balloons smaller than the others. And you can imagine that if we have many, many stacks of these sort of modules, you could get large bending areas or sort of bending motion, as well as much larger elongation as well.
Right. So now imagine we want to actually implant this soft robot. What we need to do is first we need to shrink it down, right? And then we need to place it inside the human body. There are two examples we'd like to keep in mind in our lab when we develop these sort of robots. These are long gap esophageal atresia and short bowel syndrome. So in the first case, you can see here, the baby is born with a piece of the esophagus missing, and this is a problem because then the baby cannot swallow food, right? And the second example is short bowel syndrome. In this case, what happens is you see all this black space. This shouldn't be there. It should be all pink. And what this represents is that the baby has a shorter bowel. That means that when the baby eats food, he cannot eat or she cannot absorb all the nutrients that are there. And this again is a big problem. So what we're trying to see is if we can use our robotic implants to actually treat these conditions and solve the problem.
So the idea is that we'd have a little soft actuator from earlier. So this is in its deflated state. So we've got 3 stacks that are just deflated. And the idea is that we then place that into our little baby's esophagus. And then we sort of stimulate that esophageal tissue by sort of growing and shrinking the bubbles. And then at the end, we have our fully inflated actuator. So this is our fully inflated actuator. and that would have been growing with the tissue. So then we'd have our fully grown actuator into our tissue. And the same with our baby snakes, where our little baby here with a short bowel, where he's got initially a really short sort of actuator that's deflated, and then sort of with the actuator growing, we'll have a nice long tissue. And obviously these sort of tests take a lot of time and require quite a lot of extensive testing to make sure that our robots are sort of safe and to sort of understand a bit more of the interaction of our robot with the tissue itself.
Right. So in particular, what happens is you cannot just test your robot right away. That's not possible. So you need a lot of preclinical trials. I'm sorry. Before you can actually test it inside a human body. And what happens is even those preclinical trials, you need a lot of like testing before you can actually do those trials. What we want to do in our lab is also try and see if there's a potential way around it. So to see if we can actually simulate the interaction between our robotic implants and the surrounding tissue. And for that, we're trying to develop the soft tissue simulator. So let's first think, imagine you have a spring right in front of you and you start pulling on the spring. So at the first, it's really easy to elongate the spring, and then it gets, it's harder and harder. That behavior we call stiffness, and you can think soft tissue has a similar property. Actually, you can think of soft tissue as a complex arrangement of springs. Now, our platform is actually capable of replicating the springiness of soft tissue. So we're now going to show you what it looks like. Yeah, so we have a bottom plate, which is fixed here. And then we also have a top plate, which is moving up and down, replicating the behavior of soft tissue. What happens is we place our robotic implant here between the two plates, and then we also have a force sensor that can sense the interaction between the robotic implant and the tissue simulator. So you need to imagine the higher the force, the higher the platform will move, replicating the behavior of a spring. So if we now actually inflate our soft robot, we should be able to see the behavior there. And in particular, what I'm doing now is I'm inflating our soft robot using air. Joanna was previously using water, so this is also to prove like we have we can use many different fluids, let's say, with our soft robot. So as you saw, the platform moved up a bit, and this is just to simulate the viscoelastic properties of tissue. But with our platform, we can actually simulate changing behavior. So what happens with soft tissue is there are time varying properties. So stiffness is not always the same. So imagine you have fibrosis. So your tissue starts, let's say, scarring, for example. The tissue becomes stiffer. We'd like to understand how our robot will interact with tissue in that scenario. We can do that with our robotic simulator. And then imagine you start reducing the pull on the tissue. You see that the platform starts moving down. Now, what you won't be able to see, but we are also investigating in our lab, is the actual growth of the soft tissue. So our platform is capable of simulating the growth over very, very long periods of time. And the thing is, it takes weeks to actually get that behavior, and you won't be able to see it in this short demo. But one thing that comes with these very, very long trials is fault tolerance and safety. In particular, we need to see if our robots can actually withstand the treatment for, say, weeks, so apply this force on tissue for weeks without having any problems. Or if some problems occur, the robot needs to be able to take care of these problems on its own without any external intervention. That's because you need to imagine there's a surgical intervention to place the robot where it needs to be, right in contact with soft tissue. But then if something happens, you need to like do a second surgical intervention to take the faulty robot out and place a new one and a healthy one in. And this is obviously something we really want to avoid. That's why we are using our tissue simulator to see what's the long-term reliability of our robots too.
So feel free to type any questions you may have about our robot or our tissue simulator in the chat. Any questions about soft robots too? Yeah, thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you.
So my robots, the one I showed at the beginning, they rely on having that horizontal magnet. So they mainly.
I guess one of the questions you may have is how we
wow.
build our soft robot. Sorry. There's a question by Eduardo. How much force do you think it can exert? So for our clinical experiments, we need to be able to apply a force of 2.4 newtons, and that's been sort of tried and sort of tested trials before with pigs, and that was deemed to be the minimum necessary. And so our robots, we've been able to show that we can grow them at least 2.4. Some of them sort of are capable of exerting up to sort of 9 or 10 newtons of force.
But you also need to see, like, think about soft robots as soft but also capable of very high forces if you want them to do that. So you don't need to don't think about soft robots as something weak, because that's not the case, definitely. Oh, how do you build your soft robot? Right. So if you want to go over it.
Yeah. So what we do is we've got a mix of sort of 3D printed parts as well as soft parts. So each sort of stack itself is made of those components. So at the bottom of the stack, we have sort of this 3D printed base. So it's got sort of areas in which you can expand air as well as sort of tubes, or inlets and outlets, so we can connect the tubes together. On top of that, we then layer our sort of silicon membrane. That's the part that's inflating, that's the part that's expanding. And then on top of that part, what we have is we have a 3D printed constraint. And the idea of that constraint is that it prevents the robot from straying in all sorts of directions and sort of targets it such that we have a nice sort of balloon shape such that we can have this nice grip. And then what we do is we sort of stack them on top of each other and connect them with tubing. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, we can sort of play about with how we connect the tubing, sort of either sort of having columns or sort of more diagonal or slants. We got another question. Does this robot sense? What can it sense? Is vision important inside the body?
Right. So unfortunately, vision is somewhat important, but it's not always possible to have it. But we think there's definitely other ways of sensing and newer ways of sensing. So if we think about long esophageal atresia, for example, what's important is to know the length of the soft robot and also the interaction, so what force the robot is exerting. And this is because then this information can be fed back to the surgeon so that he can decide whether or not the treatment is appropriate or not in that specific time. Now, right, you want to add anything?
Not particularly.
Well, I think one thing that's definitely important is also, let's say, pressure, for example. In our specific case, pressure tells you how much, let's say, you are inflated, but also if there's a problem. So imagine one of our bubbles bursts, there the pressure will drop. So that's a telltale sign of the fact that something has gone wrong. Now, as I was describing before, that's also one of the important areas of research in our lab. That's to see, okay, once we know there's a fault, how do we take care of it, right? Because we want our implants to be fully autonomous. So you can think about using self-healing materials, for example. So once the bubble bursts, then it deflates, and then the rubber heals itself without any external intervention. That's one possibility, for example.
Yeah, I think the other thing is that we're kind of sort of making robots that are designed to be implantable. So vision's not necessarily very achievable because you have to either have like the body open, which like obviously isn't ideal for the baby because like there's a high risk of infections and sort of just quite traumatic for the parents. And so yes, vision would be ideal, but obviously isn't necessarily achievable given our application. Ooh, we've got another question. Why did you choose to work on soft robots? Aren't there more career options in old-fashioned robots?
Right.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, I think it depends on what type of career we're talking about. So, for example, hard in terms of like a career in industry, old-fashioned robots, let's say hard robots, are definitely the way to go. I'd say for now, at least. But in more like cutting edge areas of research, soft robots are definitely really interesting. So for now, for example, um, artificial intelligence is being used in hard robots, but also a lot in soft robots, for example. So if your interest in is artificial intelligence, soft robots can give you quite a lot of opportunities. If you are a mechanical engineer or a control engineer, again, hard robots have been studied for a very, very long time, and we definitely know how to build a hard robot and how to control it. These two areas of research are quite new in soft robotics. So the modeling of a soft robot and the control of a soft robots are quite complex problems because you are working with hyperelastic materials that are not homogeneous, and it's really, say, even in our simple case, it's really difficult to tell which balloon will blow up first and which will do that last. And especially like getting a nice and uniform inflation, it's also quite difficult. So I'd say in terms of career opportunities, the number is quite high in both fields. You just need to pick what you prefer, let's say.
Yeah, I think that there's also sort of more of a move. I guess the thing is with old-fashioned sort of robots, there's been quite a lot of research already done on them. So from a research point of view, there's not necessarily much more to go. Like we've already established like really good control schemes to sort of control them really well. You know, they're very predictable. They've got hard elements. We can sort of mechanically study them, understand exactly how they're going to work. Whereas soft robots, you don't have that luxury. You don't know exactly what's going to happen. But already in industry, there's sort of the idea of old industrial sort of robots is like these big clunky things that are, you know, very, very precise, obviously, but they're not very good to sort of work with other people. So there's already been a move in sort of industrial robots towards making them at least more compliant, such that you can sort of have humans interacting with these robots rather than just having them, like these robots in a cage because they're so dangerous. So it's sort of interact. So there's already a move, and sort of I think there'll be a move even more afterwards towards using even softer robots once we've got sort of the key issues of sort of like controllability and sort of predictability down.
Of the material, cure it in no shape, and then it does like in lots of layers, so we get these complicated parts. Really
so I think we've almost sort of run out of time. So yeah, I think we'll wrap it up here. But if you've got any other questions, feel free to sort of type it in. We'll be back in sort of 10 minutes.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you for listening.
And see you.
Hi, I'm Joanna.
And hi, I'm Marco. We are from the Sheffield Biomedical Robotics Lab. Our lab specializes in soft medical robots and especially surgical robots, so robots that go inside the human body and can interact with soft tissue to treat medical conditions.
So you might have seen some soft robots on TV. So maybe some of you are familiar with Baymax, sort of the big white fluffy robot that's in Big Hero 6. And so one of the characteristics of soft robots is that they've got many degrees of freedom. So right here I've got an elastomer. So this is sort of a tube of elastomer. It's very stretchy and it can sort of bend in all sorts of directions. And obviously that's not super desirable. We don't want a robot that sort of goes in all sorts of directions. We want to be able to target the direction it goes in. And so what we can do is we can sort of add constraints. And by adding these constraints, we can sort of constrain the robot to sort of grow as well as twist and bend.
Right. So the idea behind soft robots is the softer, the better. In particular, if you think about, say, running into a soft cushion compared to running into a hard brick wall, obviously I know which one I'd rather do. Yeah. So basically, what happens is when you are interacting with a robot, it's much better for you to interact with a soft robot than a hard, like an old-fashioned one. And in particular, in our case, the robots go inside the human body. So obviously, you want them to be as soft as possible because you don't want to cause any damage to the surrounding tissue and organs, right?
And so our lab in particular, we focus on regenerative robots. So these are robots that are designed to sort of grow soft tissue. And one of the soft tissues that we're interested in is the soft tissue in the gastrointestinal tract. So that's sort of your digestive system. And the way we grow this soft tissue is by stimulating it. So the idea is sort of coined by the term mechanic therapy. And the idea is that you sort of apply forces to the tissue. So you stretch it and relax it, and stretch it and relax it. And this sort of repeated cycle of stretching and relaxing encourages the tissue to grow because it encourages the cells themselves to proliferate. And so right now I'll sort of show you a little demo of one of our robots that we've got in the lab that's designed to sort of grow this tubular tissue.
Move forward, start away. You keep going forward.
So here you can see sort of our robot. So this is sort of a stack of 3 sort of different layers. And I've also got these sort of syringe divers, which are coloured, which have got sort of different coloured liquids. So we've got some blue water, some green water, and some red water. And so what I can do is I've got this little joystick here. And so if I press down on it, what we'll start to see is that the syringe divers are going to start pumping in liquid into our little robot. So you can see sort of the liquid's going in. And so we've got a sort of blue bubble and sort of red bubble as well as some green bubble sort of inflating. And then what I can do is I can also sort of say, oh, I want to sort of deflate my red bubble. So I'll start deflating my red bubbles and then I'll sort of start getting this bending behavior. And what you can see is sort of the green bubbles are just deflated because there's a leak from it. And this is quite common in soft robots, that sort of elements of your soft robot might burst. So this is quite common. But so yeah, Abby might sort of show a little video of it working. So the idea behind this is that we can sort of be able to control the different stacks. So on the video right now, you can see sort of our sort of robot inflating nicely. It's got it's a much better one than I'm showing right now, where it's sort of inflating predictably. We've sort of deflated the blue bubbles and achieve some nice bending, and then we're going to deflate the red ones. And then we can also sort of deflate several at a time. So in the next sort of clip, you'll sort of see the blue and the red sort of deflating simultaneously. And so the idea is that if you sort of add several of these stacks on top of each other, you could get some really nice behaviors of sort of very long growth. So if you have lots of stacks, as well as sort of more extensive bending.
So as we mentioned, our robots need to go inside the human body. So let's take the robot Joanna just presented, and we first need to shrink it down, right? And then once we place it inside the human body, we can operate with live tissue to get this cell proliferation Joanna was talking about before. In particular, there are 2 examples we like to keep in mind in our lab when we develop these robotic implants. The first one is low cap esophageal atresia, and the second one is short bowel syndrome. Both cases require the tissue to grow to be, let's say, solved. So in the first case, you can see here a baby, and one part of the esophagus is missing. So this is a pretty severe condition because then the baby cannot swallow food correctly. And then in the second case, we have short bowel syndrome. So you can see a lot of black color around here when it should all be pink. This is because the bowel is too short. So what happens is you have food passing through here, and all the nutrients get sucked from the bowel, so that the kid can actually absorb the nutrients. If the bowel is too short, that won't happen correctly. So in both cases, we think we can use our robotic implants to solve these issues.
So if we take our little soft robot from earlier, so this is our sort of deflated soft robot. So it's pretty deflated. And so what we do is we insert this into our little baby's esophagus, for example. And then we start inflating and deflating the bubbles to sort of stimulate that tissue growth. And then at the end, we have our fully inflated robot. So this would be our fully inflated robot. And our tissue would have grown with this. We now have our fully inflated robot with much longer tissue, such that the surgeon could then go and attach the two ends. And the same with our little baby here with the short and the soft, bowel. So we have our little actuator that we'd insert, and then after stimulating it with by inflating and deflating the bubbles, we then have a much longer bowel for the baby to be able to absorb all of the nutrients it needs to. And so obviously these are sort of quite complicated and sort of long experiments that we need to carry out. And so what we do is we've got this sort of platform that we use to sort of understand a bit more sort of the reaction of the tissue, as well as sort of our robot in those sorts of environments.
Yeah, so especially what happens before you can actually implant your soft robot or any robot implant actually is you need to do a lot of, first a lot of experimentation to prove that your robot is safe and can actually safely interact with tissue, but then also you need a lot of preclinical trials. Now, what we're trying to do is the step before the preclinical trials. So in our case, we developed this robotic platform that can help us in simulate the behavior of soft tissue and see how our robotic implants would interact with the tissue. So in particular, if you think about having a spring with you, and you start pulling on this spring, right? It is possible to elongate it. At first, it's quite easy, but then it gets more difficult and you need more force to do that. This behavior is called stiffness, and tissue has a very similar property. So you can think of soft tissue as being a very complex arrangement of springs. And what we're trying to do is trying to replicate the springiness of tissue. So in our platform, what we have, you'll be able to see it in a moment. What we have is we have a fixed plate at the bottom, and then we also have a moving plate at the top. Now, there's a force sensor that senses the interaction between our robotic implant and the tissue simulator, so that the top platform can move, simulating the correct behavior of soft tissue, the springiness of soft tissue. So what we'll try to do now is we'll inflate our robotic implant the same way as Joanna was doing. This time we're using air just to let you see that we can use different fluids with our soft robots.
So something like the origami robot relies on a very specific
There's,
Did you disconnect?
I didn't.
exactly the same way and respond to
It seems like our electronics are finicky now.
Do we have a video of that one?
Yeah, I think we'll just show you a pre-recorded video, unfortunately. Yeah. So in the video, you can see the moving plate and the fixed plate, and then our actuator starts inflating, and you can see the green line is now following the top moving plate. And once the actuator is fully inflated, we can reach like centimeters of inflation, of elongation for each layer. And you need to think of like having many of these layers. Then what that gives you is like a very long inflation starting from a short initial condition. So with our platform, what we're trying to do is not only replicate the springiness of soft tissue, but we're also trying to simulate changing behavior over time. This is something we can actually do with the platform. So imagine tissue like starts, say, scarring, for example. You have an increased stiffness there, and we want to see how our robotic implants can cope with that, for example. But also, and maybe more importantly, what we really need to show is that our robots can be are reliable, so that they can be used over long periods of time, say weeks, because these treatments can last for weeks or months. And in that case, obviously, you'd like your robot to be fully autonomous, so diagnose the problem and also try to solve it on its own without any intervention. And this is because if the robot cannot do that, it means the surgeon then needs to do a second surgical intervention to take the robot out, replace it with, let's say, a healthy one, and that's obviously something you don't really want to do.
So hopefully you've enjoyed our demo, even with its slight hiccups.
Yep.
So if you've got any questions about anything that you've presented, sort of our actuator or the tissue simulator, feel free to pop them in the chat. We'll be here for sort of the next 10 minutes, but otherwise, thank you for listening. Ooh, so we've got one challenge, or one question already, sorry. What type of challenges do biological tissues bring to soft, hard implants?
Right.
What a question.
Yeah. Where to start? Well, right. So as I was saying, the problem with soft tissue is the fact that it's like live nature. I wouldn't say that's a problem. That's the beauty of us as humans and like tissue in general. But on a more robotic, let's say, perspective, that's a very complex system to like interact with and work with, because we're not just trying to like pull on tissue for no reason. What we're trying to do is we're actually trying to help soft tissue to grow faster and in a healthy way. So I'd say, for example, it's very difficult to attach the robotic implant to tissue because you cannot just use super glue, right? Super glue is not something you'd want even just on your skin. So imagine having it inside your body. Also, you have changing properties, as I was saying, like stiffness can change drastically, let's say. So then imagine you're applying a certain force and the stiffness suddenly drops, for example. Then what happens is you are pulling more and more, so the tissue starts elongating and you risk tearing the tissue. So
yeah, but I just want to say that the tissue also brings with it its own advantages. I mean, obviously, the tubular nature and the fact that we're going to put our robots either inside or around that tubular tissue sort of gives already sort of a structure to which we can sort of implant our robot itself. But yeah, as Marco said, like one of the difficulties is actually sort of that mechanical interaction between our robot and the tissue, and sort of understanding sort of, oh, if we place it now, how's the tissue going to react? Like, is it actually going to grow? Are we just going to tear it? Is it just going to become really scarred? Like, sort of understanding all those sorts of properties.
I'd say also, imagine there is no structured environment, right? Because soft tissue by its nature is soft and it's compliant, right? So there's your lungs inflating, and obviously all the organs are squished, right? When that happens, so that happens to your robot too. So obviously on one side, soft robots can give you that safe interaction. On the other hand, it's very difficult to predict the general behavior, because imagine now you have disturbances on the side, say the lungs are inflating. It gets really tricky to predict the behavior of your robot inside such a structure, such an unstructured environment. So that's something, again, we need to keep in mind there.
So we've got another great question from Claire. So are there any other applications of these soft robots?
I think there's so many.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the key ones is like the cellular structure that grows quite a bit. So if you ever want sort of, I don't know, a gripper on the end of sort of a tentacle or something, you could have this sort of thing where it could sort of bend in all sorts of directions, and you'd be able to use these soft robots. Other applications we sort of look at sort of maybe outside of the body as well. So sort of prosthetic devices or sort of haptic devices that sort of feed back on your sort of touch sensors and that sort of element.
I think other applications are where soft robots are actually trying to like take over more old-fashioned ones. So, for example, there's what they call cobots, so robot arms that are next to a human being. And in factories, for example, that's one area where soft robots are trying to replace hard robots. But I'd say also, in general, we as humans prefer to interact with something that's like similar to us, so it's much easier, let's say. So there are studies in psychology, for example, that are trying to see if it's easier for a human to interact with like a soft robot like Big 6, for example, or a hard robot, just because we perceive it as a very different um, being, let's say.
But in general, like not specifically in our lab, but soft robots are being applied to sort of more extreme environments where they can be potentially useful. So, for example, you've got examples of underwater robots where, for example, maybe you want to get a specimen from the deep sea. You don't want like this massive claw chomping down on potentially really precious coral or something. So you've got examples of soft grippers that can sort of delicately sort of pick it up and sort of take it back to the surface for it to be analysed. You've got examples as well in space. Where potentially soft robots can be much more complex and then sort of achieve sort of large forces as well.
With regards to the larger area, we are limited by the area.
So we've got another question. So will hard body robots eventually be replaced by soft robots? I think this is a really important question. Is that okay if I go?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think there are definitely elements where soft robots can replace hard robots. So Marco was mentioning earlier sort of these cobots, so the idea of sort of being able to sort of interact with the robots. But there are other areas, for example, I mean, I've heard of like, maybe you've got really large pet systems, right? And so there, sort of the rigidity and sort of the fixedness and sort of being able to sort of do loads of repeated tests in a very systematic manner is one where soft robots probably won't be ideal. So I don't think they'll take over every sort of discipline, but I think there's definitely room for them to be.
I think what we also need to keep in mind is that we are now really working on soft robots. That's because there's a lot to be discovered there. But you can also imagine a future where the benefits of both worlds are kind of like integrated. And our example is one of these. So, for example, our robot is not completely soft because we have some bits that are actually 3D printed in hard resin. We call this a hybrid soft robot. And while other bits, like the membrane, are made out of silicon and can have huge deformation. So in the future, we'll definitely see some applications where some soft parts are actually integrated with like rigid parts to get the best of both worlds.
Robots that I demonstrated at the beginning with the wheels, they rely on that one coil in the
Oh, so we got another question. When will one of these robots go into a baby for the first time?
Again, I don't know if you want to answer this, but I think it's years away.
I think it's definitely like 5 to 10 years away. So there are some moves like in our lab, we kind of want to start doing some animal trials. So that's kind of one of the first stages. So obviously, we've got our tissue simulator. We can also do sort of tests on ex vivo tissue. So this is tissue that's sort of already dead. And so our next sort of step is to do these animal trials to sort of understand a bit more what happens with our soft robots in a sort of constrained environment of the body we don't necessarily have access to it, and sort of understanding how sort of the tissue grows with these interactions.
I think also one, let's say, obstacle we need to try and go over is the perception by surgeons, for example, because unfortunately, as you discovered during our demos, soft robots are quite unpredictable, and it's also easy for them to like burst, for example, or imagine you touch something that's sharp, you can burst your bowel. So the perception is they are not necessarily the most reliable type of robot. That's what we're trying to overcome with our experiments to see if we can actually have our robots, have soft robots so reliable that can actually be inside a human body for weeks.
So we got another question. How does the fabrication of these robots comply with standards of high throughput manufacturing? Is or will this be taken into account?
Right.
I think already in this robot, we've got elements that are 3D printed. Now, 3D printing has become like quite common and is quite sort of repeatable in sort of manufacturing, and you can do it at very large scales. So that's already one element. our soft sort of membrane, that's kind of an element that's sort of more unpredictable. But you could possibly imagine sort of having large pieces of silicon that you then sort of pre-cut the different membranes. So there is sort of the potential for this to be sort of manufactured at a much larger scale.
So that's at 17:30. We'll be back at live on air.
Right. So I think we answered most of the questions. So we'll be back in 10 minutes. If you have more questions, keep typing them in the chat and we'll answer them later. And yeah, thank you for listening. We'll be back again in 10 minutes.
Bye.
See you. Bye.
Hi, I'm
And hi, I'm from the Sheffield Robotics Lab. Our lab focuses on soft medical robots and especially surgical robots. So robots that go inside the human body and can interact with tissue to treat medical conditions.
So you might have heard of some soft robots. You might be familiar with Baymax. He's the big sort of white, huge, fluffy robot in Big Hero 6. And so one of the particularities of soft robots is they're made of soft material. So for example, here I've got an elastomer. So this is one of the ones we use in the lab. And so it's very, very stretchy. And so what comes with this stretchiness is obviously it's very compliant. It can sort of move in all sorts of degrees in sort of directions. And that's not really desirable. We don't want a robot sort of going in all sorts of funky directions. We want to be able to sort of target the direction it goes in. So the way we do this is we sort of add constraints. And so with these added constraints, we can make the soft robots grow as well as twist and sort of bend in sort of the directions we want them to.
Yep. And the idea behind soft robots is actually the softer, the better. In particular, if imagine you run into a soft cushion, that's probably fine. But if you run against a hard brick wall, that's a huge problem, right? So with soft robots, what we're trying to achieve is a safer interaction with humans, and in particular, like say interaction, like if you want to help human beings, right? And in our case, the robots go inside the human body, as we mentioned, and that's even more complex because you want your robot to really, really be soft so that you're not causing any damage to the surrounding organs and tissue.
And so our lab in particular, we focus on regenerative robots. So these are robots that are designed to grow tissue, and we're particularly interested in the gastrointestinal tract. So that's the sort of digestive system to which your food goes. And so we're interested in that sort of soft tubular tissue. And the way we sort of grow this tissue is we grow it by stimulating it. So the idea is sort of coined by this term mechanical therapy. So the idea is that we sort of apply forces onto the tissue, so we stretch it a bit, and then we relax it. We stretch it, we relax it. Through this cycle of sort of stretching and relaxing, we sort of encourage the cells themselves to proliferate, and that makes our tissue grow. So I'll show you right now sort of one of the robots that we work on in our lab. So this is our soft robot here. So this soft robot here is made of sort of several stacks. So we've got 3 different stacks, each with 3 different bubbles. And then on the side here, you can sort of see our coloured liquid. So we've got some blue water, some green water, and some red water. And they're all sort of controlled, those syringes, by some syringe drivers. And over here, I've got my little joystick. Now, if I press down on my joystick, what you'll see is that the liquid will start being pumped into our robot, and then we're going to start seeing bubbles being formed. So you can sort of see the robot is rigid robot is sort of growing. And then what I can do is I can sort of say, oh, I want sort of my red bubbles to inflate a bit less. Not very well, unfortunately. Or for example, maybe let's try the blue one, so the blue one. And so what we get is by sort of deflating certain bubbles, we get sort of this bending behavior. And so I think we're going to show you a quick video that we sort of took earlier that kind of sort of exemplifies this. So on this video, you can sort of see that the soft robot that I showed before. So again, we're sort of inflating all those bubbles. And then what we can do is we can sort of deflate some more. So here we've sort of deflated the blue column of bubbles. And so you'll see a nice sort of bending. Same with the red ones. And then because we've also got sort of control of each set of column of bubbles, we can sort of inflate 2 at the same time. So we can inflate the blue and the red simultaneously and sort of achieve even more bending. And so through this, we can sort of get 360 degrees of different bending angles and sort of growth. And you can imagine that if we stack multiple of these layers on top of each other, we get a lot more sort of pronounced bending as well as twisting.
Right. So now think about that robot implanted in a human body. The first step is to actually shrink the robot as much as possible so that it's not bulky and can fit inside the human body nicely. And then the second thing is you want it to be interacting with tissue, so you need to connect it somehow. Now, there are 2 examples we like to keep in mind in our lab when we develop and we design these sort of soft robots. The first one is long-gap esophageal atresia, and the second one is short bowel syndrome. In the first case, you can see here, the baby is born and a bit of the esophagus is missing. So this condition is problematic because then the kid or the baby cannot swallow food correctly. And then the second condition, the short bowel syndrome, is the fact that the bowel, the baby is born with a shorter bowel. So you can see here a lot of black space, and these should all be pink. So in particular, in this condition, what happens is when the kid is digesting food, um, the baby cannot absorb all the nutrients that are there just because the bowel is too short.
So if we take our little soft actuator, right, it's a nice little drawing. So we've got a fully sort of deflated actuator. So we imagine then sort of placing that inside our sort of little baby's esophagus. And then we sort of stimulate those bubbles, we'd inflate them, we'd deflate them. And at the end of our experiment, we'd have a nice sort of fully grown actuator. So all the bubbles would be fully inflated. And our tissue would have grown with it. So we'd have a nice fully inflated actuator and our tissue would be grown. And then our little surgeon would then come and attach the two ends together. And similarly in our baby steps, where we'd have, again, our sort of mini deflated actuator that would be implanted into the baby. And then we sort of use it again, inflating and deflating the bubbles to sort of stimulate that tissue. And then we have a fully inflated actuator at the end with a much larger intestine.
Right. So as you can imagine, this task is quite complex for our robot, just because, first of all, this procedure, like the length of this procedure is weeks or months. Then you also need a lot of preclinical studies before you can actually implant a robotic implant inside a human body. So what we're trying to do in our lab is taking care, let's say, of all these steps before the actual clinical trial. And for that, we're trying to develop robotic, let's say, robotic replacements of soft tissue. So to understand what we are trying to do, think about like having a spring in front of you, and imagine you start pulling on the spring. At the beginning is quite easy, so the spring starts elongating. But then the more you pull, the more difficult it is to keep elongating the spring. And that behavior is called stiffness. And you can think of soft tissue as having quite a similar type of behavior. Especially, you can think of soft tissue as being a very complex arrangement of springs, right? So with our robotic, with our tissue simulator, with our robotic tissue simulator, what we're trying to do is actually replicate this springiness of soft tissue. So in particular, as you can see here, there's the robotic simulator consists of a bottom fixed plate and then a top moving plate. In between these plates, there's our robotic implant, and the interaction between the robotic implant and the robotic tissue simulator is sensed using a force sensor. So as you can imagine, as you inflate this robotic implant, you are applying more and more force against the top and bottom plates, and the top plate will move, replicating the behavior of soft tissue. We'll now try to run our second demo, and in this case, you'll see we'll use air to inflate our soft robot, while Joanna was using water before. And this is just to show the versatility of these soft robots, where you can use many different fluids to inflate them. So now, as you can see, the bubbles are forming, and the top platform, the top plate starts moving because there's because of this interaction between the soft robot and the platform. So with our platform, we're not only capable of replicating the springiness of soft tissue, and just to show you, if I deflate the bubbles, the force is decreasing, and the top plate moves down accordingly, just like a spring would do. But what happens with tissue is actually the fact that these properties, say stiffness, change over time, so they're not just constant. In particular, when there's an interaction with a robotic implant, what happens is the tissue can develop scarring, and that brings gives you increased stiffness. What we want to understand is how our robot can cope with that changes in the properties of the soft tissue. But more importantly, we want to run very, very long experiments just to see if our robots are actually safe enough and actually reliable enough to be implanted for longer periods of time. In particular, this is important because you can imagine the human body as like a distant planet. You do a first surgical intervention where you implant your robot, and then you just wait and let the robot do its thing. Now, if there's a problem there, you want the robot to be able to take care of the problem on its own without any intervention. That's because that means performing a second surgical intervention, taking the robot out, the robotic implant out of the body, and either fixing it or replacing it with a new one. And obviously, that's not what you want because that's not ideal for the patient, right?
So thank you for listening. If you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. You've just seen one of our soft robots, as well as our tissue simulator that we use to sort of understand a bit more how our robots interact with the tissue. So we've got one question. How do you build your soft robot? So Mark is going to help me demonstrate this. So basically, what we do is we have different stacks that then we sort of connect fluids. So each stack itself is made of a bottom sort of 3D printed base. So that's what Mark is showing here in blue. On top of that base, what we have is we have a rubber membrane, silicon rubber membrane. So that's sort of what Mark is showing you here, that we kind of try to our best ability to show in red. And so we layer that on top of our base, sort of trying to align the different holes that we have. And then on top of that, we have our 3D printed constraint. And this constraint helps us to sort of make the bubbles grow in whichever direction we want them to be. And then once we've got our full stack, what we do is we then sort of combine them with other stacks and sort of connect them physically. So in my case, for example, when I was showing you my demo earlier, I connected them in columns. But you can imagine sort of connecting them in a diagonal and getting more sort of twisting behavior.
Okay, so well, I mean,
so the question, sorry, just to be clear, how can students get involved with soft robots at home?
Right. So fortunately, we have the internet, and there's a lot of resources there, and especially I think one website, which is the Soft Robotics Toolkit website. I think there one can find a lot of material on how to replicate some simple soft robots at home. In particular, because these soft robots, they're not only cheap, but you can also actually actuate them without, say, electronic components. So you don't need fancy DC motors or electric motors to actually use them. But what I'm showing you here is just one of our stacks in just a simple syringe, for example. And if you just push here on the syringe, what you get is a nice and perfectly inflated bubble. So you can actually replicate one of our soft robots at home quite easily.
Yeah, you can also sort of make simple soft robots out of sort of balloons, for example. And I think, as Mark mentioned, the soft robotics toolkit, there's actually an example on there, I believe, of an edible soft robot. So you can actually make it using sort of edible materials. And if you imagine sort of maybe gummy bears, what you can do is you can melt those gummy bears and use that as your soft material. So another question, are there any other applications of these soft robots?
I think there are many, actually. So right now we just showed you one, and what we focus on in particular is, say, surgical robots that get implanted, but you don't need to limit like your imagination to soft robots being inside the human body. If we think like outside the human body, actually there are researchers trying to develop soft robots that can rival old-fashioned hard robots in like weightlifting, for example. Because don't think about soft robots as being weak just because they're soft. There are soft robots that can actually lift, say, tens or kilograms. And so some applications are just industrial robots. Some other, say, if you think about Baymax, for example, is soft robots are used when they need to interact with humans, for example, because it's not only safer for humans to interact with soft robots, but also there are studies trying to understand if humans prefer actually to interact with soft robots just because they perceive them as friendlier, let's say, than hard robots, for example.
Yeah, and I guess some of the other applications we in our lab are potentially like haptic devices or prosthetic sort of devices that would go outside the body instead of inside the body as our implants, as well as potentially using sort of multiple stacks of these and then a gripper at the end to sort of get a sort of three-dimensional gripper that can move in its environment.
And you can also think about interacting with other living creatures. So, for example, there's underwater applications where you're trying to manipulate either, say, corals or fishes, for example. You want to be really careful there. And so a soft robotic gripper, for example, is the best choice there. And you wouldn't choose a hard gripper, for example, because then you risk damaging the coral, for example.
When you say ordinary robots,
So we've got another question from UK Robotics. So what does the future hold for soft robots?
I'll let you answer this one.
Okay, I think soft robots is sort of growing. Like it's quite, I guess the first example is sort of the McKibben muscle, which maybe was in the 1960s or something. Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of been sort of existing, but I guess it's sort of more last 10, 20 years they've really exploded and there's been a lot more research. I think for me, one of the areas I think sort of soft robots is going to grow in is sort of there's been a lot of development of like soft actuators, soft sensing, some sort of elements of sort of controlling these soft robots and a bit of sort of computation. I think what really is the future is sort of bringing all these elements together and starting to sort of explore sort of fully integrated soft robots that have sort of this computation, sensing, actuation, as well as the control, all embedded in a soft system. And there is one example, sort of Octopus, I think from the University of Harvard, where they have sort of demonstrated it, but there's still quite a sort of number of examples sort of showing this. So, next question from Dana. Should we envisage bioartificial or hybrid robots in the future?
Well, I would say that's definitely something that is interesting thinking about and experimenting with. We are kind of doing that in our lab too. So we have a platform which is called the robotic bioreactor, where we are actually interfacing living cells with like a robotic implant, and we're just trying to see how the two interact together. Because obviously, tissue in general is not only a very complex system, but it's also full of potential. Because think about if you cut yourself, it doesn't take long for your skin to actually heal, and you don't have the problem anymore, right? So imagine now being able to have all these nice features in your robotic application. So I think the future definitely has this bioartificial nature in itself. We just need to really work on it, I think.
Yeah, I think there's also quite a few examples of bio-inspired robots. I mean, one of the sort of, I guess, most famous soft robots is potentially like these octopus tentacles, because octopus are like famous sort of soft animals. And so there's already quite a lot of development that's sort of taking inspiration from soft mechanisms already existing in nature and sort of trying to implement them in a robotics way. But definitely, I think that there's potential to potentially integrate some of these sort of organisms into our robots themselves to sort of enhance the capabilities, because we can achieve quite a lot, but like nature's had thousands of years to improve certain functions, and it's probably a bit naive to assume that as roboticists we can reproduce them within our lifetime.
If you've got more questions,
So I'd say thank you for listening. If you have any questions, keep typing them in the chat, and we'll try to answer all of them. But yeah, I think that's it. So thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening.
And
have a lovely evening. Bye.
bye.